in some virtual reality talking about the past or the future.
Humanity was much more embedded in nature than it is now.
The only way out of this complex crisis,
pointing to the larger sense of I am.
Hello friends, I'm Neil Douglas Klotz. Some people know me by my Sufi name, Saadi. Welcome to this mini class, broadly speaking, the Christian tradition in our dances, and also the mystical tradition of Jesus from his native language. My own background with the dances of universal peace begins in 1976 when I first did the Kalama dance, a dance of Samuel Lewis, and I went out of my body for several minutes. Based on that, I went much more deeply into the dances, and in 1981 I had a, you could say, vision from Murshid Samuel Lewis, the creator of the dances, and also from Jesus. And out of the, you could say, the vision and the message from Murshid Sam, Tasneem Fernandez and I started the dance network. It was a network at that point. At that point, the dances were at a very low place, and they were only being done in Sufi circles. And the message from Murshid Sam was that they needed to be danced by more people outside of Sufi circles, and so we wanted to train people, whether they were Sufis or not. And out of the transmission from the Master Jesus, this comes the Aramaic prayer dances and then the other Aramaic dances, which became really essential both to the work of the early dance network and also to my own work as a dance leader. So, I mean, that's basically been my life for the last 40, 50 years. Well, my contribution to the DUP is really, as I say, we started the Dance of the Universal Peace Network in 1982, and for the next 40 years, many of us worked in this area. It was a non-hierarchical, you could say, network, which was dedicated to training people, training new leaders in the dance. My own personal contribution to the dances has been with various dance cycles. Obviously the Aramaic prayer dances, the Beatitude dances, there are dances from the Gospel of John, and various zikr cycles, which are connected to surahs of the Quran that many people know. And I would say these are, in addition to a few other dances like Gate Gate, Para Gate, these are some of my main contributions to the dances, really, and it continued. Probably my other main contribution to the dances is through this cycle called the Native Middle Eastern goddess dances. And it was in this I was trying to use the same methods that Samuel Lewis uses and just use the sacred phrase and then have something organically arise out of that. So this uses the different ancient Middle Eastern god and goddess names in a cycle of about 8 dances. You could say the main contributions of Christianity, or I would say of the Jesus transmission, and which is not always the same, is a transmission of, you could say, love, but also of wisdom, and how individuals can integrate in their bodies this love and this wisdom to become a new kind of human. Now, in terms of historical Christianity, of course, the words of Jesus are used in various ways historically. I don't think I need to describe that. Sometimes not always in very good ways, or often not in various good ways. Today, what we have in terms of Christianity is some very, very different branches around the world. You could say that there is something like mainstream Christianity, which uses rather standard Christian theology to interpret the words of Jesus. Then there's more spiritual Christianity, and this includes churches like Unity, like Religious Science, Church of Science of Mind, Unitarians to some extent, and in other cultures, that is not in non-English cultures, you will find also these spiritual churches that may combine native traditions with Jesus traditions, you could say, in an organic way. Then there's the mystical traditions of Christianity, and this involves the great mystics like Francis of Assisi, Hildegard of Bingen, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Meister Eckhart, and a lot of these folks whose phrases then come into our dances. And then finally, I would say, and this has been my main interest, this is the tradition of Jesus as a native person, his native language Aramaic, and the practices, you could say the depth that is revealed by a look at what he's actually saying in his native language. And this is often entirely different from what Christian theology has said. So this has been a healing for many people who have found, perhaps in their youth, Christianity or the type of Christianity with which they were raised, shall we say, somewhat abusive. So this has been a healing for them to find out really what Jesus actually said, which was not that he's trying to save us, not that we need to save our soul, but that he wants us to let our soul save us, that is, redeem us, redeem our purpose in life. So these are, I would say, in terms of also our dances and in world culture, what we find all over the world that's, you could say, going under the general banner of Jesus' words, Jesus' tradition, something like this. When people think about the Christian tradition, they mainly think about churches and what churches are teaching and what ministers are saying and things like this. And this is still, around the world, mainly what you find as different forms of Christianity. You could say it's a preaching tradition with hymns, often in a very positive sense, social justice programs, especially, for instance, with liberation theology in South America, but also, you could say, a great contribution of charitable works from Christian churches all over the world, especially from individual people. I would say this is one of its main contributions, that people begin to feel this love, this charity that Jesus speaks about, care for their neighbor, and then actually to help, to contribute. Of course, on the other side, as I mentioned briefly, we have all of the historical abuses of Christianity, which have unfortunately included, especially when it unites with various forms of empire, has included justification for racism, for colonialism, and for other, you could say, injustice in terms of gender, and various other problems in our society. Both of these things are going on at the same time, historically, over many, many hundreds of years. Right now, there's a great movement within even mainstream Christianity to bring more spiritual, you could say, feeling, spiritual experience into the tradition, because especially in Europe and in other cultures, people are leaving the churches. There's no energy there for them. There's no, how do we say, there's nothing there for them. And in today's world, people are looking for something deeper than just the minister speaking to you and telling you what you should think and things like this. So when you're leading the dances, especially Christian dances, or invited to lead dances at a Christian church or a Christian community, you need to look very carefully at what, for this particular community or church to which you're invited, what they're interested in, what is sacred to them. And that can be very, very different. And this will then affect which dances and which, you could say, sacred phrases you use when you visit or when you lead dances. Mystical side of Christianity, this has a number of very, very deep elements. If we look at Jesus' words alone, we have his words in the Gospel of John, for instance, which speak about a direct transmission, a connection between our own small self, Ina, and the source of that small self, Ina. Ina, Ina. So he speaks of, this is where these phrases come in the Gospel of John, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the bread of life. For instance, Inan alachma dahai, connecting the small self to the source of that small self. This is bread, this is food, this gives us life, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, this is interpreted later by Christian theology to mean that Jesus is speaking about himself personally as the only way. But this is not what he's speaking of if we look at his words. Then we have Jesus, for instance, in the Gospel of Thomas. And there Jesus acts more like a Zen master, actually. And in the what Thomas community remembers, Jesus speaks about the path of self-knowledge, uncover what is within you, he says. If you fail to bring forth that which is within you, he says in the Gospel of Thomas, that which is within you will destroy you. And if you bring forth that which is within you, that which is within you will redeem you. And by redeem, he means it will show you your purpose in life, show you how to live, show you why to live. And he goes on to say, there's nothing hidden that will not be uncovered, nothing covered that will not be uncovered. So he goes on like this in the Gospel of Thomas. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is another very, very early Gospel, we have Mary Magdalene having a direct transmission from Jesus in the moment after his crucifixion. And this again comes into a mystical tradition where people also seek to bring through messages from Jesus, not from before, but from now. And this is a real thing. I've experienced it myself. Also, in the Jesus tradition, you could say in general, for instance, in the Lord's Prayer, or what's called the Lord's Prayer, a Wunderbashmaya prayer, there are two aspects of Jesus' mysticism. One is the connection to creation. That is, that creation is always going on. He speaks of this often in the Gospels. In other words, creation didn't just happen a long time ago, and here we are now, and we're stuck, we're doing what we are. No, miracles are always possible. Creation is always happening. And so it's possible to connect to this living creation and, as Jesus says, do the works that I have done and greater. One of the later mystics who connects to this creation mysticism, actually there's several. One is the great German mystic Meister Eckhart, who speaks in similar terms. Hildegard of Bingen, again from Germany, speaks about this living creation tradition. John Scotus Erugena, who is one of the Celtic mystics, speaks also of creation and nature as a revelation of the divine, not from before, but right now. The other side of this tradition, you could say, is Jesus, Yeshua as holy wisdom, as Chokhmah, as Sophia. And this is another creation story from the Bible, where creation is not just happening like this, vertically, from the breath, slowly into us, embodied, 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 but creation happens like this, like a circle, in a conversation, in a feast, in giving and sharing of food. This is an old tradition from Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, in the Hebrew Scripture. And Jesus acts as holy wisdom. That is, he gathers to himself all sorts of people who at his time, were not really permitted to eat together. They weren't permitted to be seen together, male and female, so-called clean and unclean people. And he brings them all together. So even though Yeshua, Jesus, is in a male body, he is seen by many of his early followers as the embodiment of feminine wisdom, that is Sophia, or as she is called in Aramaic, Hakimah. The whole notion of gender at this particular time is very different from our own. So everyone understood that the human soul is created male, female, both. Genesis says this, actually. And so it wasn't a problem that here we have this fellow Yeshua, but yet he's embodying holy wisdom, something you could say feminine from the Bible. And so this could go both ways. A human being was seen as a combination of, you could say, masculine and feminine, not with all the stereotypes attached that we have today, but much, much lighter, much, much looser than what we have. So the mystical depths of Christianity are immense. Now, they're, of course, not always used in Christian churches and often ignored, but they are there, and they're very important for our dances, because this is the main food, you could say this is the main source from which the most important sacred phrases come that we use in the dances of universal peace. We have a number of important sacred phrases that come into the dances. from this tradition. The oldest phrase from Greek-based Christianity, that is not from Jesus' original Aramaic, he doesn't say these words, are, as many people know, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. So these are Greek words. As I say, they probably come from about the 4th century, something like this. Kyrie is a word that's usually translated Lord, but the Kyrios, you could say, also was originally, you could say, the one who provided the bread for the people. Christe usually is interpreted to mean an anointed one, but this again gets into very complicated Christian, you could say, theology. Originally, Christe would be the Aramaic Mashiach, and Mashiach means a person who is blessed to do a particular job. And sometimes this happened with this anointing by oil. And we find, of course, I think one of the Marys anointing Jesus in the Gospels. This is, one of the important stories. So that's Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. Not all Christian churches will recognize this. For instance, especially with all of these English language gospel churches that people may encounter, particularly in North America and more in Europe, you have these English language hymns, which are often, well, some can be very beautiful, and some can be very full of Christian theology. That is this sort of fall and redemption theology that Christianity gets from St. Augustine. That is, you're sinful from birth, and so you need to be saved, and a lot of this, Jesus is going to save us. Jesus, of course, never says anything about this. This fall redemption tradition is nowhere in the Bible. As my friend Matthew Fox, who many of you know, writes about in his book, Original Blessing. But, for Matthew Fox, and I follow in his footsteps, the message of the Bible was original blessing, not original sin. And Jesus comes to revive this and show individual people how to work with this. We have other, you could say, phrases that are used in Christian dances. Alleluia, of course, which comes from the Hebrew, which means all breath is returning to the one. Really, if you look at the individual words, there are many other dances that come through this person. The Aramaic dances, which, as I say, began with the Aramaic prayer and now number a couple of hundred different dances. The depth of the phrases, if you look at any mystic in their native language, is always going to be much more than if you look at it in some translation. This doesn't always prevent problems from theology or from religion, but it gets you closer. I mentioned previously the misunderstanding of when Jesus says about I am. He cannot actually say I am. He can only say I, ina. And so the interpretation of these phrases as meaning Jesus is the only way or Jesus is the bread and all these things, this is unfortunately what Jesus never meant to say. Likewise with the Beatitudes, these blessed are sayings that appear in both Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, and Gospel of Luke. There have been problems with the interpretation of this in Christianity. For instance, many of these Beatitudes were interpreted to mean, okay, for instance, blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted. Okay, so if you're sad now, you'll be joyful later in heaven. But Jesus is not talking about this. He's not talking about any later. He's talking about now. Tuehun means ripe, blessed in the moment. This is the first word that's usually translated blessed are. And what he does is reframe the experience that his listeners are having, and this could be mourning, this could be grieving, this could be homelessness, this could be whatever. he reframes this and shows them how this can be a doorway to a bigger reality. And that is not later, that is now. Most unfortunately, some of these Beatitudes have been interpreted to mean, if you suffer now, even if I'm making you suffer, you'll get your reward later in heaven. And again, liberation theology has overturned this, thanks God. But again, you still do find this interpretation in many Christian churches. And so it's always delayed. Jesus is not talking about delaying. He's talking about finding our real soul, what he calls ruha, now. And this ruha, the big, infinite soul that is including and enclosing our small self, is what will redeem and show us how to live. You could say that the other Christian dances that we have, and there aren't that many, I have to say, may come from, for instance, Taizé music. This is the beautiful community in France that has, for instance, the phrases Ubi caritas et amor, I believe St. Paul, where charity and love are, there God is. So beautiful phrases in Latin or in Greek, and many people have done dances to these. These are lovely dances. I would say those are the main categories of dances that we currently find from the Christian tradition right now. So the relevance of this whole tradition in our daily life, and again, I'm speaking personally here from my understanding and from what I've experienced over decades. Jesus shows us a way to transform human consciousness to be different. As some of you know, Einstein says we cannot solve problems from the same consciousness that created them. So many authors have written about how do we reach this new type of consciousness. If we look at Jesus' words, particularly in the Aramaic, he's showing us how to reach this different type of consciousness that embodies not only a relationship, you could say vertically, with all that is, but also horizontally with all of nature, with creation, with everything, and integrate these two. Looking at the long view, you could say hundreds of thousands of years ago, humanity was much more embedded in nature than it is now. We had very little individual self. We wore, as it were, our subconscious on the outside. That is, our everyday consciousness was more like a dream life. So when we looked at a tree, we saw a spirit. When we looked at a plant, we saw not only the substance, not only the material, but also the living being that was around it. Now, these ancient traditions are still available today to various people. We know them through various native traditions. And yet human consciousness in the general culture has become almost the opposite. Instead of embedded in nature, separate from nature. Instead of very little self, a lot of self. I mean, much self. Almost you could say to the fantasy that only the individual self exists and only the material world exists. There is no other outside. There is no other deeper world. There's no world, you could say, beyond what we see. And so Jesus shows us how to get beyond this, to come from where humanity was, and now he foresees where humanity is going to go, and how to integrate them in a new way to be human. So both of these can operate at the same time. How? Through love. Through love, through willingness, through devotion, through being willing to act, as he calls about it, honestly, with chanuta. So this is the word usually translated as righteousness. He uses this in the Beatitudes, and he says, if you hunger and thirst for this chanuta, which is the inner honesty, which becomes outer honesty and justice, then you will be able to build this new world around you. And I think this, for me, this is really why I continue to teach in this particular tradition. It's not that there aren't other very, very deep traditions, other mystics, you could say other messages which are similar, but for me, Jesus is, you could say, exemplifying how we can be human in a new way. And as I said, do the works that he has done and greater than these. And we need these. We need this new world. We need a few miracles. We could use a few angels to help us, and well, he's there to help us.